Despite having an ideal blend of speed and run after catch ability, Georgia wide receiver Zachariah Branch has a lot to prove before anybody should be eyeing him as a number two wide receiver in Atlanta.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which is now the number one sports podcast network in all of the universe. And today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by FanDuel. Use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for a chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And today is our second mock draft Monday of the offseason. We'll be breaking down Luke Easterling's 3-round mock draft for Athlon Sports and look at his 2 selections for the Atlanta Falcons. 2 that go target their 2 biggest needs, or at least what I would argue are their 2 biggest needs, which is wide receiver and cornerback. And we'll talk about 2 day 2 options at those 2 spots, how they potentially fit here in Atlanta. One fits pretty well, the other one not so much, but we'll break that down. And then later in the episode, we'll get into why context matters when we get to the combine, which will begin later this week. But in Luke's mock, he had the Falcons taking Zachariah Branch, the Georgia wide receiver, in round 2 at pick 48, and then Texas cornerback Malik Muhammad in round 3 at pick 79. And starting off the conversation talking about Branch, he fits into that sort of tier 3 of wide receiver prospects, something I broke down for my insiders earlier this week when discussing how this wide receiver draft class sort of stacks and in terms of the top 10 or so guys. And there's kind of 5 guys in tiers 1 and 2 when you look at sort of the consensus rankings of some of the more prominent draft people like Mel Kiper, Daniel Jeremiah, Dane Brugler, and a handful of others. There are 5 guys that are projected to be kind of first round picks that are in tier 1 and tier 2. And, you know, the tier 1 separates from tier 2 is just tier 1. Those guys typically are projected to go in the top 15 to 20 picks, and tier 2 are in the latter part of round 1. But then you look at tier 3 and tier 4, which is where I think if the Falcons are going to target a wide receiver in round 2, this is where they're going to be more than likely picking from. We'll see if guys can sort of move up to different groups across the offseason, but there are 4 guys in tier 4. That's Malachi Fields of Notre Dame, Chris Brazzell of Tennessee, Omar Cooper of Indiana, Zachariah Branch of Georgia, who we'll talk about today. Tier 4 consists of Jeremy Bernard of Alabama and Chris Bell of Louisville. And I'm sure over the course of this offseason, we will talk about several of these guys over the course as potential round 2 options for the Falcons. But when we talk about Branch specifically, you know, he checks a lot of the boxes that we've talked about before, where if you want to have that number 2 wide receiver be a complement to Drake London and do some of the things well that Drake London doesn't necessarily excel in, things that Drake London is fine at, but not necessarily strength of his game. We're talking about speed. We're talking about dynamic yak ability. And of course, Branch also checks that box of having those return skills. And so he can add value in the third phase of the game, not just on offense. But despite those skills, does Branch really sort of fit the paradigm of a complete receiver, right? Because when you look at his college career, 2 years at USC, then his past year at Georgia, you know, he was almost exclusively a slot receiver, right? Nearly 80% of his snaps across all 3 years were spent in the slot. And so that's an open question in terms of, can you survive outside? Can you beat press coverage? And given that he didn't really get asked to do that a lot over the course of his college career, that's very much an unknown. And so if that's the case, and that speed that he has, how valuable is that going to be at the next level, at least in terms of being that sort of deep threat that we're looking to sort of take the top off of a defense opposite Drake London? Because if you can't beat press, you know, on the outside where you're more likely to face it than you are in the slot, you know, how valuable is that speed? And then you look at a lot of Branch's production. A lot of it came on screens. A ridiculous amount of it came on screens, especially this past year at Georgia. About 50% of his targets, I think it's exactly 49.5% of his targets this past year, according to PFF, were screen passes. Rarely do you ever see college players above like 20-25%. That's a high number for college players because roughly 20-25% of all college passes are screen passes. That drops to about 10% in the NFL. And it begs the question of, is Branch just purely a gadget guy? Right? Because when you do see guys that have that level of production coming from screens, it usually correlates with guys that struggle to transition to the NFL. Guys like Malachi Corley had 44% screens in his final year in college. Velus Jones, 31%. Velus Jones, notably, has been transitioned to running back, right? Colin Lacey, a guy we talked about before the Senior Bowl, I kind of said that's a running back. That's not a real wide receiver. He was 35% screens. And so half of your targets being screens basically means that Zachariah Branch is no different than a running back. He's not necessarily a true receiver. But the question is, with Branch, it's the question of can't versus didn't, right? And it's like, was he asked to do certain things at Georgia and at USC because he can't do other things? Or was he just didn't get the opportunity to do those other things? And, the thing that you can say about Zachariah Branch this past year at Georgia is that when it came to the rare opportunities that he had to run routes down the field, he was far more effective. A 67% catch rate on all targets that were 10 or more yards down the field, which is a big improvement from his 2 years at USC, where it was the 36% catch rate, but it was a very small sample because he was only averaging about 1.5 targets per game when it came to those 10+ yard throws, which is a very low number. I've seen people compare, Zachariah Branch to guys like Zay Flowers and Wan'Dale Robinson, and you compare those guys in their final years of college, they were averaging over 4 targets per game on those 10+ yard throws. So they got more opportunities. Again, that can't versus didn't, right? Are you not getting those opportunities, Branch, because you can't do those things, or you just didn't get those opportunities because of the specifics of Georgia's offense and whatnot? And so my overall impression of Zachariah Branch, I think he's a talented player, but I think he's kind of a gadget guy, and I don't think that's worth a second-round pick, right? He's number 75 on Dane Brugler's top 100 board right now, and I feel like that's the right range for where he should go. So, like, if he slides to pick 79 for the Falcons in round 3, I could get more on board with him being worth that pick, just because you don't typically get guys with his skill set as a sort of quote unquote premier gadget guy, at that point in the draft. And I think that may be more worth chasing in round 3 than necessarily in round 2. And so to me, the reason I conclude that is just because, like, how much better is he going to be in terms of this gadget role, which I think is kind of the ideal role for him, which is much more of a number 3 wide receiver. To me, he's much more Ray McCloud than he is Darnell Mooney in terms of projecting him in his future. Now, maybe you can develop him beyond that, but I'm skeptical of that, given, all the things we've mentioned, where it's just like, typically this type of wide receiver does not have a lot of success in the NFL. Now, he could be the exception, but I think when I think of some of these other gadget guys that will be definitely available in day 3, thinking of Colin Lacey of Louisville, Barry and Brown of LSU, all these guys that are slot guys, or Brown, I played a lot of outside, but slot guys, return skills, yak guys, Cade Wetchen of, Iowa, right? And I'm sure to longtime Falcon fans, of a certain age, you're reminded of the Tim Dwight years, and sort of a similar very skill set. And apparently Weegan, I think his name is Weegan, was killing it at the Shrine Bowl this past year. So, those are the types of guys where I'm like, I don't think the drop off between what Branch is going to add to your roster and what those guys are going to add to your roster is that different, right? Like, Branch can do more on offense, but I don't know if he's going to do a whole lot more to justify taking in rounds 2 or 3 when you can get some of those other guys in rounds 4, 5, 6, or potentially later that can do a similar thing. And so to me, Branch makes a lot more sense in a world where the Falcons address their number 2 wide receiver spot in free agency, and then they're bringing in Branch to be that number 3 guy. I think that's the ideal role for him, is more of a number 3 than a number 2 guy. And who's that free agent wide receiver that's going to realistically solidify that spot that makes you feel better about Branch, right? I don't think the Falcons are going to be in the Alec Pierce market because he's going to be way too expensive. And then you look at guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, Rashid Shaheed, Deebo Samuel are also kind of, those fast, gadgety return guys, right? So they have an overlapping skill set of Branch, so they don't really work together. And so it really kind of leaves you, at least from my eyes, where it's like, okay, well, if the Falcons sign maybe Romeo Dobbs or Jalen Naylor or somebody like that, then maybe pulling the trigger on a guy like Branch makes a little bit more sense after that point. But to me, the type of player that I think a lot of people envision Branch being, which is that yak monster, that vertical threat, that return specialist, to me, that player is Casey Concepcion. He's a tier 2 guy. Luke Easterling had him going 34th overall in his recent mock draft. I think Concepcion, of the wide receivers I've evaluated, I think probably is the guy that complements Drake London the best because of the yak skills, because of the vertical ability. I think he's a much better route runner. I think he can not only survive on the outside, but potentially thrive on the outside due to that speed, and that speed is going to be more effective for someone like a Casey Concepcion out of Texas A&M than it will be for Zachariah Branch at the next level, just because Branch is probably almost going to exclusively be a slot. And then, you couple that with like, oh, well, Branch is a slot, then that's less opportunities for Drake London to be a slot. And as we've said ad nauseum for the last 4 years, the best element, the thing that makes Drake London as good as he is being arguably the championship belt holder for the big power slot receiver role, and adding a guy that's a slot only guy, to me, that doesn't really mesh. So when I look at Zachariah Branch, I see a talented player. I see a player that could blossom in other places that are looking for a slot only guy, looking for more of that gadget guy, because they've already filled out the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2, and they want to add that element to their offense. But Atlanta's not quite there yet, right? Just because you have Drake London, who I think should be spending 30 to 50% of his snaps, if not more, in the slot. And then you don't necessarily have that number 2 answer at the wide receiver spot answered there. So we'll see if, the combine will increase his buzz. I expect him to test extremely well. He was a track guy in high school. He's going to run fast. He's going to jump far. He's going to jump high. So I'm sure the buzz on Zachariah Branch will be much higher this time next week, assuming he tests well at the combine, than it is right now. But I have a lot of question marks. But, I have less question marks for the round 3 pickup in Malik Muhammad, the Texas cornerback. And we'll talk about whether or not he complements AJ Terrell as that sort of big corner that the Falcons are looking for as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So wouldn't it be nice if doing your taxes was as easy as handing the ball off to Bijan Robinson? It is now with TurboTax full service. You can hand off your taxes to a local expert and not have to stress from start to finish. It's just like handing the ball off to Bijan and letting that man cook. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything from your W-2s, your self-employment forms. They're going to work to get you every deduction. All you got to do is upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver, and it's going to give you real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling, just like you get peace of mind knowing that Bijan Robinson is playing football. So for a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. So I want to thank everyone that is an everydayer of this Locked On Falcons podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And the offseason doesn't exist for the everydayer, especially if you're a part of the Everydayer Club. You can join the offseason discussion about the Falcons year-round and get every episode ad-free. Just head on over to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more. So let's talk about Malik Muhammad, Luke Easterling's selection for the Falcons in round 3 at the cornerback position out of Texas. He was at the Senior Bowl. It was an up and down week for him at cornerback. probably, more downs than ups when it came to his performance, but he's a good sized corner, 6 foot, 188 pounds listed at. We'll see what the official metrics are later this week at the combine. He's number 90, I believe, on Dane Brugler's top 100 board. And so roughly a third round sort of projection based off of that. I think he's a physical corner, can be effective in press man coverage, is also comfortable playing off coverage. I think has, good instincts in zone coverage. I think the big knock on him and the big questions are, how athletic is he? Right? Does he have the top end speed? Does he have the premier change of direction that will allow him to sort of match and mirror in man coverage at the next level? I think he has the tools that he can go toe to toe with some of the bigger wideouts, but can he handle some of the quick separators and whatnot? Now, as we've discussed many times over the years here on this podcast, AJ Terrell is elite when it comes to handling the quick, fast separating type of wide receivers, but typically struggles against the more bigger physical guys that he can't necessarily push around. And so I think Muhammad does sort of complement that skill set where it's like, okay, well, we'll put AJ on the quick separators and we'll put Muhammad on the big guys. And I think that works for them. The challenge, of course, is not every NFL team is going to allow you to match up that way because they're not going to just have, a big guy and a separator. They might have two separators. They might have two big guys. And so that's going to potentially create problems when one of your corners excels in one area and your other corner excels in the other, where it balances each other out, but it's not always going to be a favorable matchup for you depending on who you're facing. But like I said, I think it does definitely fit the style of corner that I think the Falcons should be looking for to play that CB2 spot across from AJ. To me, the question is, does Muhammad have the type of upside that he can lock down that spot long term? Or are we going to be in a situation where it's like, 2 years from now, like he's fine, but we can definitely do much better than Malik Muhammad and potentially, drafting a first or second round corner that may be a little bit better in that regard, especially since AJ is not getting any younger and you might need to start planning for finding that CB1, after AJ in a couple of years and whatnot. And so I think the combine is going to be real important for a player like Malik Muhammad to showcase, how athletic he is and hopefully test well. That will, I think, solidify his stance as, a top 100 cornerback that I think in certain metrics like speed and agility, if he can test well in those areas, you'll feel really good about taking him in round 3. If he doesn't necessarily test well in those areas, it does lead, he still may be a third round pick, but you kind of look at him as more of a sort of placeholder type of corner. It's like, well, we need a corner, someone who's better than Mike Hughes. Malik Muhammad could be that, but is he the long-term answer? And it's like, yeah, we just need a guy that can be an upgrade over Mike Hughes for the next year or two, and then we'll find someone who's better and whatnot. And so that is kind of where I kind of feel based off of Muhammad's potential testing, where the more an athlete he is, the more I think it's likely that he could be a long-term solution there. But, I don't have a problem with the Falcons pulling the trigger on a player like Malik Muhammad in round 3. This is the type of corner that we should have been chasing over the last 3 years instead of all the shrimps that the Falcons have been, targeting at that spot for, 4 or 5 years under Terry Fontenot. But, ultimately I do think how Muhammad looks from the neck down from an athletic standpoint is going to matter because cornerback is so much of a neck down position in contrast to safety, which is much more of a neck up position. And so I think for players like Malik Muhammad and other corners in this draft class, the combine will be very meaningful in my humble opinion, because so much about playing cornerback in the NFL is about your ability to match up. And the more athletic you are, the more likely it is that you'll be able to match up with a larger pool of wide receivers. And so that is better than only being able to match up with like a smaller pool of wide receivers, right? So we'll see what Malik Muhammad delivers this weekend at the scouting combine. But because it is combine week, let's give a brief overview of why the combine matters. Right? We'll be talking more about it throughout the week, but sort of just big picture, it's all about context, right? Similar to what we were discussing a month ago when it came to the Senior Bowl, context really matters, and we'll break down why as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, if you've ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals in person, you can, because FanDuel is going to give you a chance to turn your dream into a reality with their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works: use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you'll automatically be entered for a shot to win an NBA Finals trip for two. That's right, flights, tickets, the whole experience. And if you're already looking at the board and thinking about, I believe this team could make a deep run, this is the perfect time to lock it in, right? We love futures bets this time of year just because we're coming off the All-Star break, and it's whether we're picking that team that we think can make a championship run or grab a conference title. It's going to add an extra layer of excitement for every game down the stretch. And now, not only can your pick win you some cash, it can also send you to the finals. So visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for your chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's talk about combine testing, right? Because the combine, some people overrate it, some people underrate it. It's that Goldilocks zone. You gotta get it just right. It's like it's underrated by some, it's overrated by others. You got to get that context just right. And so, I think one of the common mistakes for people that I think tend to overrate the combine is they tend to double count traits and skills. Like, for example, if we're talking about a player like Zachariah Branch, right? If he runs a super fast forward, like a 4.29, like, for me, like, that doesn't really move the needle all that much because we already knew he was fast. We didn't know exactly how fast he was, but 4.29, 4.39, it's like, okay, well, we already knew he was fast. So it doesn't move him up the board if he runs a little bit faster than what we thought he was going to run. It's when a guy is like, oh, I think he's like a 4.5 guy, and then he runs like a 4.39. You're like, oh, okay. I didn't see that on film. That's where those 40 times really matter. But I think one of the reasons why people tend to be dismissive of the combine, particularly when it comes to wide receivers in those 40 times, is because when you look at all the guys that have run the fastest 40 times, the sub 4.3 40s, right? Very few of those guys have turned into future NFL stars, right? Mike Wallace, I believe, is the only one in the mockdraftable.com database that ran a sub 4.3 40 and had a 1,000-yard season in the NFL. And Wallace was infamous during his days in Pittsburgh as being that sort of one-trick pony, which was a deep threat and not a whole lot else. And we saw that worked for a time in Pittsburgh and did not really work elsewhere around the league. And part of the reason is because at a certain point, having that sort of premier speed doesn't really add a whole lot. Like, there's not that much functional difference on a football field between a guy that runs a 4.27 versus a guy that runs a 4.37, right? Both guys are going to be faster than most cornerbacks that they face, will be able to threaten defenses deep, but the 4.27 guy isn't really adding a whole lot. And so, like, if you factor in that a normal pass play takes about 3 seconds, a 4.27 guy, if he runs in a straight line for 3 seconds, in theory, he's going to cover about 0.6 more yards, less than 2 feet, than what a 4.37 guy is going to cover. And that's not really making a huge difference on a football field, especially when you have corners nowadays that have 30 plus inch arms that can easily make up that difference in terms of that gap and whatnot. And so we know that most routes aren't necessarily guys running in a straight line for 3 seconds. And that's where the agilities really matter for the wide receiver position, especially than necessarily pure speed. Now, when you look at some of the stars in terms of the agility drills, the 3 cones, the short shuttles and whatnot, you're, especially at the wide receiver position, you're typically going to see guys that maybe had a little bit more success in terms of the guys that had the lead score. Not everybody, but typically, like JSN, who obviously just won Offensive Player of the Year this past year, was elite in his agility drills at the combine several years ago with a 96th percentile 3 cone, a 97th percentile short shuttle, according to mockdraftable.com. And so you've seen that translate, even though he's not necessarily the fastest guy in the world or the most explosive receiver. He knows how to get open. He knows how to separate and whatnot. And then the other thing I think that matters, especially with combine testing, is, it matters kind of how big a guy is when he tests well. Like, Julio Jones is a perfect example of this, right? That when Julio ran his 40 time in the mid 4.3s, that's far more impressive doing that at 220 pounds like he did 15 years ago than someone else doing that at 180 pounds, right? We always talk about force equals mass times acceleration. And so Julio is generating a lot more force than some of these other guys, which is, not as meaningful maybe for the wide receiver position, unless you're talking about a guy that you want to line up as that X wide receiver and beat press. And it's like, oh, he's going to generate a lot of force, and good luck trying to press that man at the line of scrimmage and combating that force if you're a cornerback, flat-footed on your heels with the amount of mass that man is accelerating. But particularly over the last couple of years, really since that 22 draft where Jordan Davis and Trayvon Walker blew up the combine that year, like weight adjusted 40s have been much more something that I've paid a lot more attention to over the last few draft cycles, especially for positions like D-line where explosiveness really matters, right? Where it's like, we do want to generate a lot of force, right? It's not as meaningful for wide receivers to generate a lot of force, but for a defensive lineman, oh yes, we want as much force as possible. And so paying attention to those 40 times, especially when those guys are doing it at, high amounts of weight relative to their positions, Walker being 272 pounds at the combine. I forget what, Jordan Davis was like 338, 348, something like that, something ridiculous. And being able to run as fast as those guys did. So I think that's kind of the context you're kind of looking for, rather than just simply, oh, this guy's the fastest guy at the combine. It's like, okay, was he 167 pounds? Like, okay. I mean, running 4.23 or whatever is always going to be impressive. But like, if my man is like 171 pounds, I'm less impressed with that than I would be if he was 192 pounds, So that's kind of my thoughts on that. And the final things I'll say is, this is the time where I usually go on my anti-RAS rant. RAS referring to RAS, or relative athletic score, that you see especially this time of year floating around, and people being like, oh my god, this guy has a 10.0 RAS and this guy has a 9.8 RAS and he's an incredible athlete, we've never seen an athlete like him before. And I feel like RAS is a very useful tool, but if you've been listening to this podcast for the last few years, you've heard me talk about, I think it's one of those things that's very overrated. I think people look at it as the end all be all for athleticism. And I think it's an element, it's an aspect. It can be a quick sort of indicator of like general overview of how athletic a person is. But I think there are some fundamental flaws that undermines how effective it is as the sort of one number that is the best way to determine who's more athletic. Is a 9.6 guy that much more athletic than a 9.3 guy, or an 8.8 guy, or whatever the case may be? Yeah, I can pretty much guess that a 9.6 guy is definitely a better athlete than a 4.9 guy. And when it comes to the RAS scores, but like some of those slight nuances in terms of that different number, I don't think are necessarily true. And part of the flaws I have with RAS are it factors in bench press, which is probably the most useless testing at the combine. It really does not apply at all to football. It's just kind of indicative of like who's been hitting the gym across their college career. And like those are the guys that are bench press. Like, again, nothing wrong with having a good bench press, but I would not at all really evaluate any player, whether they have a really high one or a really low one, historically speaking. And then the other flaws with RAS is it just always assumes that bigger guys are more athletic than smaller guys, which I understand why it does that, but I don't think people realize that like RAS is always going to assume that a 6'5" guy is more athletic than a 6'2" guy, when it's just like, that's not how that works. He's bigger than a 6'2" guy, and there's ways to factor that into measurables like weight adjustment, but just automatically giving a guy who's 6'5" a boost over a 6'2" guy, to me, doesn't make a ton of sense, unless it's like specifically for a position where it's like it's better to be 6'5" than it is for 6'2", but RAS doesn't work that way. The same would apply for a guy who's 290 pounds versus a guy that's 250 pounds, and it's like that guy is not automatically more athletic than the 250-pound guy, the 290-pound guy. So those are my issues with RAS. I think it's useful, but I would pump the brakes for those people out there that try to use it as the sort of be-all, end-all when it comes to who's athletic and who's not. But that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Our next episode, we'll be talking about how Javonte Williams' deal could impact Tyler Allgeier's market, and maybe that helps or hurts the Falcons' ability to retain him. And we'll also talk about the tragic end to Rondale Moore and the need for mental health in this male-dominated sport. So that will be the next topic of Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting to get you guys geared up for this week's combine. And if you never miss an episode of Locked On Falcons, the Everydayer Club is built for you. You can get Locked On Falcons ad-free and members-only Discord access. All you got to do is head on over to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to join the club. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every